Hello, and as always, welcome to Abnormal Psychology. We are moving right along to chapter 4. This, I think, is our last chapter before we get into disorders. So, bear with me today. Today is one of those days where we are going to talk about some topics that some of you who have more of a psychology or biology background are going to get easily. And other people who don't may struggle a little bit with what I say. So either just grab a hold of what I say and move on, or go back to your book, look up more information. Make sure you grasp at least the main concepts that I'm discussing, okay? All right, ready? Let's go. Today we're going to talk about theoretical perspectives. I'm really going to focus here on some of the neurological, biological, genetic factors because you get less of that information in your beginning psychology courses, as well as when we talk throughout the semester about different disorders. We are going to talk about which neurotransmitters are affected, which brain parts, if you will, kind of to dumb it down here, which brain parts are at play. So just to kind of start here, we have this word that we use called paradigm, right? And a paradigm is just a conceptual framework. It's a way that we think about things. And we often talk about sort of paradigm shifts. And people in society believe one thing strongly and they feel a lot of value in something. And then as time goes on, maybe as the next generation comes along, there may be a paradigm shift where we now see something differently. Maybe we say, well, we've progressed in our feelings about this and we've had a paradigm shift. Okay, so it's generally just a perspective or conceptual framework from within which scientists operate, and that is psychologists being the scientists here. Okay, it's important to note that we're never totally objective. Anybody who thinks that they are 100% objective, it's just not really completely possible, especially when we're talking about psychology. There are going to be some subjective factors that interfere. So we like to be able to operationalize terminology, and we like to say, you know what, I do see things from this particular framework, just to be honest. And so that's where I'm coming from when I describe mood disorders or whatever it is. Okay. We must say that no one paradigm completely explains psychopathology. So it is important to know these different types of ways that we see psychology and see mental health issues, so that you can take a few of them and use them as they pertain to your particular client or that particular client's issue. Okay? This is generally just an orientation to understanding. How do we understand the causes of human behavior? How do we understand the treatment of abnormality? So first we're going to talk about the biological perspective, and we're going to talk a lot about this, all right? With the biological perspective, we say we assume that disturbances in emotion, disturbances in behavior, and disturbances in cognitive processes are caused by abnormalities in the functioning of the body. Okay? A neurotransmitter. So we will talk about different neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. These are some of our big players here. And we will talk about them within each diagnosis. A neurotransmitter is a chemical substance released from a neuron into the synaptic cleft. I'll show you some pictures in a minute here, okay? The idea is that the neurotransmitter drifts across the synapse and then is absorbed by the receiving neuron. Here are some neurotransmitters that we see involved in psychological disorders. Okay, norepinephrine in depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, serotonin, depressive and disorders, anxiety, schizophrenia, eating disorders, substance use disorders, GABA, anxiety disorders, substance use disorders, dopamine. We see this more in like Parkinson's on one side of the spectrum and schizophrenia on the other side of the spectrum. You will hear more about that when we discuss those disorders. Eating disorders, substance use disorders, acetylcholine, neurocognitive disorders due to Alzheimer's disease. And then we have opioid peptides, okay, and those are typically related to substance use disorders, okay. You don't have to memorize all of those things now, but have a general idea, okay. Genetic influences. Now, the big question, dun dun dun, nature or nurture, right? Well, basically what we want you to know is that it's both. Okay, some people say nature via nurture, some people say nurture via nature, and the idea is that both things play a role. So let's start here. Genetic abnormalities can come through inheritance of a particular combination of genes, having a faulty copy of a gene when cells reproduce, mutations that a person acquires over the course of their life. Okay, so a lot of different genetic abnormalities happen. Heredity plays a role in most behavior. That is, that we do get some of our behaviors, positive and negative, from our parents, our biological parents. We also get things from non-biological parents, but right here we're talking about genetics. Genes. Genes are carriers of genetic information, okay? These are things you should already know from your kind of basic science courses. So genes are the carriers of that genetic information, or that DNA, okay? They're impacted by environmental influences. That is stress, relationship, culture. We're going to talk in a few minutes about something called the diathesis stress model, which will explain this a little bit more. Okay, we have this relationship between genes and environment. And it is, like I said, it's bi-directional. Okay, our genes affect the way that we are in the world and where we are in the world, and our environment then affects how our genes respond. Okay, again, bear with me, we'll get to this. Okay, there's this term, I do want you to know it, it's endophenotypes. Okay, so we have phenotypes and genotypes. Just thinking about what I want to do. Okay, we have phenotypes, genotypes, all these things, and then we have endophenotypes, which is generally the term for the combination of genetic and environmental contributors. Okay, so the combination of those two that play into complex behaviors. One thing psychologists love to do is make up words or combine words, so endophenotypes, okay? We have this relationship between the genetic and environmental influences. Gene-environment correlations, interactions between genes and the environment, and here's that term that I said I would talk about in a minute. And that is the diathesis stress model. So this is this idea that people are born with predispositions, so genetic predispositions, meaning you're born with a set of genes. These particular genes put you at risk for developing, let's say schizophrenia. Okay, so let's say you have the genetic makeup that puts you at risk for developing schizophrenia. Now, interestingly, two people, let's say identical twins, may have the exact same genetic predispositions. Based on their environmental factors, one may have those genes turned on, and that's what we say turning on those genes, and then they will develop schizophrenia, as to where if the other twin or other person who has this genetic predisposition has different environmental factors and those genes are never turned on, they never have a psychotic break. They never develop schizophrenia. I kind of like to put it into different terms. And let's talk about diabetes, okay? So interestingly, some people have a genetic predisposition for diabetes, and other people do not. So some people, and I mean type 2 diabetes, let me be clear, okay? Type 2 diabetes. So some people that have a genetic predisposition for type 2 diabetes, who are then introduced to significant high calorie, high fatty processed foods regularly, will develop type 2 diabetes. Someone with that predisposition who is, exercises and eats healthy food and maintains a lower caloric intake will not develop type 2 diabetes. Okay. Now, interestingly, someone who does not have that genetic predisposition can eat donuts all day or carrots all day and will still never develop type 2 diabetes. They may have some other issues, but they won't have that one. I hope that example helps you understand this diathesis stress model. Now, of course, that we're talking about a medical issue, but we then use that same idea when we're talking about depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, any of these other things. Okay. So some important genetic terms that you should just know, right? So gene expression is proteins influence whether the action of a specific gene will occur. So will the gene be expressed or demonstrated? Okay. Polygenetic transmission is when multiple gene pairs are at play versus a single gene. And really, most of the time when we're talking about complex behaviors such as depression or psychological issues, it's really a polygenetic transmission. Rarely is it a single gene expression. It is in certain cases, such as specific intellectual disabilities, but most of the time we're talking about complex behaviors and multiple gene pairs. Irritability. Irritability is just a word you want to know because we will talk about it with each disorder and how irritable that disorder is, right? So if you have a parent or an uncle who has this disorder, how much more likely are you to have it than if you didn't? Okay, so the extent to which variability in behavior is due to genetic factors. Some things have high genetic factors at play and others have low. The estimates range from 0 to 1. So you're going to get a point, whatever it is, for each disorder. Okay. Behavior genetics. Okay, behavior genetics, this is the study of the degree to which genes and environmental factors influence behavior. And in here we talk about these two different things, our genotypes and our phenotypes. And again, you should probably know this already. The genotype is unobservable. It's the genetic material that's inherited. The phenotype is what we see, right? The phenotype is brown hair or, whatever color your eyes are. It's the expressed genetic material. It's observable behavior, observable characteristics, okay? So it is the attention deficit disorder behaviors that we see. All right. More terms. Gene-environment interaction. We talked about this already, right? One's response to a specific environmental event is influenced by genes. Now, epigenetics, and this is why I put this gene-environment interaction here again, is to help focus in on the term epigenetics. And that is the study of how the environment can alter gene expression or function, okay? We have something called the cross-fostering adoptee method. So here's an example of that. we have rats, right? Lots of people start with rat studies. We have rats that are born to mother with low parenting skills. So born, their birth mothers had low parenting skills. They were raised by mothers with high parenting skills and showed lower levels of stress reactivity. Okay, so the environment, the mothering in this particular situation, was responsible for turning on or turning up the particular expression of a particular gene, okay, or not turning it up, right? So cross-fostering adoptee method, right? So that is, we see biological traits, but then we put them in a different environment and see what happens then, okay? One of the other examples that I've used in the past is simply plants, right? If you take seeds, you have the exact same types of seeds. They're equal seeds, equivalent seeds, and you put one of them in dried up old soil and you leave it in a closet. And you take the other identical seeds and you put them in fertile soil where they get sunlight and water. Well, one of them grows and one of them doesn't. And this is, they had the same genetic material, if you will, but the different environments make a very different outcome. Okay. We have reciprocal gene-environment interaction. So genes predispose, tripping over my words, genes predispose individuals to seek out situations that then likely increase the likelihood of developing a disorder. So this is where it gets all confusing and we say then like nature, nurture, nurture, nature. So for example here, adolescent girls with a genetic vulnerability for depression are actually more likely to seek out experiences that will trigger depression. Okay. So this is sometimes kind of considered a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And that is that I may be more likely to develop this, but I also put myself in situations where somebody is more likely to reject me, and then I feel upset. As to where somebody who doesn't have that may not put themselves into that situation, and so on. I hope that makes sense. Okay. We have genetics research methods, okay? We have family inheritance studies. So with family inheritance studies, researchers compare disorder rates across relatives who have varying degrees of genetic relatedness. So aunts and uncles and cousins and identical twins and non-identical twins, fraternal twins, all sorts of things, okay? We have genome-wide linkage studies. Okay, so in genome-wide linkage studies, the genetic method in which researchers study the families of people with specific psychological traits or disorders. Okay. Now, close to that is genome-wide association studies. So, right, so not linkage, but association studies. In these, researchers scan the entire genome of individuals who are not related to find the associated genetic variations for a particular disease. I hope that makes sense, right? So we're looking at completely different non-related people to say, these two people have the same disorder. What is the same? Okay. Now, close to this is neuroscience. Sort of go from there to here, right? So before we were talking genetics, now we're talking brain, right? Neuroscience. It examines the contribution of brain structure and function to psychopathology. mental disorders are linked to aberrant processes in the brain. Okay? 3 components here. We look at neurons and neurotransmitters. We look at brain structure and function. And we look at the neuroendocrine system. Okay, we're going to briefly touch on each of these. So here is the neuron. I really do want you to know some things here. Okay, so see, we have some major parts of the neuron that I do want you to recognize. Okay, within the neuron, and these are little cells that are in your brain, we have the cell body here. Look, our little nucleus, you should recognize those things, right? So cell body, we have these long things that come out. These are called the dendrites, okay? And then the third thing that I usually talk about is the axon. And right here along, we have the axon. And then we have, down here, we have terminal branches. And at the very end of the terminal branches are something we call terminal buttons. I like to think of them as being cute. Tiny terminal buttons. So what happens is we have information that comes in. And information means neurotransmitter information. Okay, so neurotransmitters come on into the cell and they come into here and they store up. And they store up and they store up and they store up and they store up until there is enough in there. Now, enough is going to be different for each one. We have something called an action potential. The action potential means shooting neurotransmitters from the cell body down the axon and out the terminal buttons, okay, and on to the next neuron. So interestingly, the action potential is what we call an all or nothing mechanism. So that is, you never have just like a little one where they kind of come out. It's either they do it or they don't. They send the information or they don't send the information. But the information goes like that down here and comes out and then on to the next one, and it goes in and it stores up and it goes out. Now, of course, this all happens really, really, really fast. Sometimes I like to sit around and think about my brain sending information as I'm thinking, but then sometimes that's a little too much to think about. Okay, so those are our major parts: cell body, dendrites, axon, terminal buttons. The nerve impulse is what I'm talking about, that action potential. The synapse, okay, so the synapse right there is this gap right between the terminal buttons and then the next cell's dendrites. So here is a better picture of that, okay? So if you can see, we have the synaptic space, we have the synaptic vessels, we have this axon, some people call it a terminal branch, and then we have our terminal buttons, okay? So interestingly, we have these neurotransmitters, again, our serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, all that kind of stuff, GABA, that stores up here. They're released in here. I think of them as dancing around a little bit between the terminal button and the next neuron. And then they go into the next one. Some of them get sucked back in, which is called reuptake. Others go on. They stay in between for a certain period of time. When we talk about chemical imbalance, if you've heard that word when people talk about depression or other things, they talk about this chemical imbalance. And when we talk about that, what we mean is many, many things. We could mean they stay out and dance for too long. It may mean that they do not stay out long enough. It may mean that too much is taken back up into the presynaptic neuron. Maybe too much is pushed out. All sorts of places where it can go wrong. It's amazing how we function. Okay, so we have these words like over here, right? We have our, how did I get this red thing? we have our different words, right? Our neurotransmitter, our receptor sites, our postsynaptic neuron, our excitatory, inhibitory, our reuptake, all those things that I just mentioned. Okay. Moving on. Okay. Here we have our neurotransmitters and psychopathology, right? So those are the things that we talked about before. Dopamine, serotonin. We did mention these a bit before, right? Related to depression, mania, schizophrenia. We have norepinephrine, which is indicated or implicated, if you will, in anxiety and other stress-related disorders. GABA, interestingly, affects some of those other things. So it inhibits nerve impulses. It's implicated in things like anxiety. Okay. Like I said, sometimes you have excessive or inadequate levels. Sometimes there's insufficient reuptake. Sometimes you have excessive numbers or sensitivity of postsynaptic receptors. Sometimes these second messengers that we won't even get into right now help the neurons adjust receptor site sensitivity after periods of high activity. We have things that are called agonist or antagonist drugs that, either stimulate neurotransmitters or inhibit, that is, dampen neurotransmitter receptor sites. So again, the amount of complexity here is pretty great. I say that in an exciting way because you really need to take an entire class on this, or an entire many classes on this, to actually understand it. I ask you to know your basic terms for this. And I ask you to know the basic terms so that when we talk about each disorder, you will know, oh yeah, that's what she's talking about, right? When we talk about serotonin, when we talk about dopamine, when we talk about what's going on in the brain, we really want to note that each disorder has brain activity involved with it, and often some malfunctioning of brain activity. I'm going to show you a few pictures of the brain here just to give you some ideas of all the things involved. You don't have to memorize all of these things, okay? So just noting that the brain has two hemispheres. It's connected something called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum sends information from one side of the brain to the other side of the brain. And we will discuss that in a chapter in the future when we talk about neuropsychological issues, okay? We have these things called sulci or fissures. They're basically the squiggly lines, okay? In our brain, we have the frontal lobe, we have the prefrontal cortex that I talk about because the prefrontal cortex helps us with making decisions. The frontal lobe in general is our making us human part of our brain, okay? We have the temporal lobe here, the occipital lobe back here, the parietal lobe here, okay? And again, each has different functioning that I won't go into now. When we look at the brain, if you slice right through it, we have all these different parts. And again, just to have this as a reference to come back to when we talk about these things throughout the semester. And that is, we have our myelinated sheathing, as I usually say, myelinated sheathing. And that is, well, remember on the picture of the axon, there is basically some covering on that axon, and that is the myelinated sheathing, okay? We have the thalamus, we have the brainstem, we have the cerebellum. Cerebellum means little brain. And they're all responsible for different things. Okay, and then we also have the endocrine system. Okay, and the endocrine system is going to be the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal cortex. We usually call this the HPA axis, right? HPA axis. Often this is involved in stress. It triggers, the release of endorphins and cortisone. The pituitary gland releases these, different types of hormones. So often the HPA axis is involved with stress and other types of hormonal issues. Okay? All right. Subcortical structure of the brain is the limbic system. The limbic system apparently is an outdated term, but we still use it. The amygdala, right here, we talk about often when we talk about emotion, so anger and fear and things like that. Okay. All right, so treatment. When we talk about biological paradigm or the biological perspective, we talk about medications, surgery, other direct treatments to the brain. Okay, maybe psychotherapeutic medications, psychosurgery, and sometimes electric convulsive therapy, which we will talk about later. ECT or electric convulsive therapy is used for, it basically induces a seizure in someone and is used for somebody who has severe depression. It's also sometimes used for people with Alzheimer's disease. Okay. If you've seen old videos of ECT, it's upsetting to watch. And you can Google or YouTube those kinds of things. ECT in the past was done for people when basically they were, I hate to say this, but misbehaving in hospitals, or they thought it would work for people with schizophrenia, and it doesn't. And it was done in a kind of less humane way. Now, when people do ECT, we're talking about people who medication hasn't worked for them. They, if it's depression, they still want to kind of kill themselves all the time. They're using this now also, like I said, for people with Alzheimer's disease. I'm not as familiar with that. Your book talks more about that piece. But the idea is now you go into the hospital and they give you medication to put you to sleep. They put a little mouth guard in, they have you on the bed, and they put little electrodes on each side of your head that sends electricity into your brain, and it creates a seizure, a small seizure. And the idea is that in the past, they saw people that had had seizures, and right at the end, there was this period of euphoria and clarity. And people report that after going through this, they feel a bit more clear. They feel that they have, they don't want to die, right? Now, people have some memory issues that sometimes go along after this, but the idea of not wanting to die anymore is worth it for people to have some memory loss. Okay, some people go in for ECT treatments once a week, once a month, sometimes just one time, just to kind of give them a little jolt, if you will, back into the world of being okay. All right. Here is a list. I'm not going to go through this, but a list of psychotherapeutic medications and the different disorders that they're used for. Feel free to pause this, take a look. Okay. We are going to move on here to the trait theory. We talked about this when we talked about the NEO-PI the other day in the assessment chapter. The trait theory has a 5-factor model where we say these are different personality traits. So here they are. And the idea is that everything's on a spectrum. So you can be extreme to not at all. And usually people are somewhere in between. But the 5-factor model is extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and something we call openness to experience. And if you think about that assessment, it was NEO, so N, neuroticism, E, extroversion, O, openness to experience, and then personality inventory. I don't know why they left out these other two, but that's what they call it. So you can look at these things. People find that they are higher or lower on different ones of these. So that's the 5-factor model. That's the trait theory. Okay. Moving on, we have the psychodynamic perspective. Now, there are people that still are very into the psychodynamic perspective and people that do psychoanalysis. That's not something that I was trained as much on. It's not something that I use. However, I find great value in history and learning about where we came from. And Sigmund Freud, as a theorist, came up with a lot of stuff and really put psychology on the map. And so he is very important. I also disagree with some of the things that he feels very strongly about, such as your penis envy, if you will. But again, I've said it before, Sigmund Freud did some drugs in his time. Okay. Freud's theories, and this is important because this is language that people use and you should therefore know it. Freud talked about the mind having 3 structures, and that is the id, the ego, and the superego. The id contains those sexual and aggressive instincts. The id is basically a toddler, right? The id wants to do whatever it wants to do. It wants to have ice cream for every meal, and if the id sees like a girl that it likes, it just runs up and grabs that girl's rear end, right? Now, jumping forward to the superego. The superego is the person's seat of morality, right? The superego, I think, curtsies or bows everywhere it goes, right? The superego wants you to, if you see a lady that you like, you would say, "Hello, lady. Would you like to go on a date with me someday?" More refined, right? So id is a toddler, superego is like a manners person. And then the ego is in between, right? The ego is the center of conscious awareness. The ego regulates the id and the superego. So the ego says, okay, look, id, I know you want to grab girl's rear end. And superego, I know that you want to take 1,000,000 years to like get to know her if she wants you to, right? So I'm going to compromise here and we're going to ask her out. We're going to hang out. And eventually, if she wants to, maybe, we can, get to know each other better eventually. So this is our id, ego, and superego. And points being, id is like a toddler, superego is very refined, and the ego in the middle has to navigate how to be a normal person in between those instincts. Okay, now defense mechanisms. Okay, so again, these are terms that are not scientifically sound, but they are language that people use, so I do want you to know them. Okay, defense mechanisms. The idea is that it's a tactic that keeps unacceptable thoughts, instincts, and feelings out of conscious awareness, and therefore protects the ego against anxiety. Okay, so here's a list of these defense mechanisms. I do generally want you to know some of them, right? Like repression or projection. Those are ones people use often. So, for example, repression would be the idea that you unconsciously exclude disturbing wishes or thoughts or experiences from awareness. Of course, this doesn't really work that well, repression, or else everybody would use it instead of letting our disturbing things that have happened bother us, right? Denial, we don't really have to go into that. That's pretty self-explanatory. Projection. Projection is when you attribute undesirable personality traits or undesirable feelings onto someone else. Okay, so we project, right? If you think about a projector, we project things that we don't really like about ourselves onto someone else. Okay. Another one that's kind of more popular or known is regression, and that is dealing with emotional conflict or stress by acting like a child. Okay. Freud also talked about psychosexual stages, and that is he had this idea of a normal sequence of development through which each individual passes between infancy and childhood. We won't go into all of those things. Those things are in your book, though. Okay. Post-Freudians, we've got our Carl Jung, who talked a lot about archetypes. If you are not familiar with archetypes, please look that up. Archetypes are things like the idea of a mother is nurturing and loving, and the idea of the shadow is that it's kind of scary and lurks in the dark, those types of things. We have Alfred Adler, Karen Horney, who came out and did some more what we would now call feminist theories. Erik Erikson. So all of these guys came after Freud and said, I don't know about some of your ideas, but here are some other things that I think might be related but better. Okay. This is not your Psych 101 course, so I will not go into all of these people. You should already know this stuff. Okay. Another person who we do still talk about, and there's a lot of research based on her work, is Mary Ainsworth. And she does the infant attachment styles. And when we talk about attachment styles, we talk about secure, anxious, and avoidant. And there are a few others that have been added now. But again, in your beginning psych courses, you really learn about these things. Or in developmental psychology, or probably like a child clinical course. Okay. Treatment. When we talk about psychoanalytic treatment, we want to bring repressed unconscious material into conscious awareness. So we do something called free association. Free association is basically just talking. So basically you sit on a couch or lie on a couch for hours, several times a week, and you just stream of consciousness talk. And the therapist listens. The other idea with it is that you have something called transference. Transference would be that you transfer, let's say you had negative feelings toward your mother and you sort of transfer them onto the therapist, and then you respond to your therapist in the way that you wanted to respond to your mother, and you can kind of, I guess, figure things out that way. Again, this is not really a research-based type of treatment. However, there are people that have found benefit in it. Okay, now fully researched type of treatment is the behavioral perspective. Of course, the behavioral perspective alone has some issues, right? Because it doesn't talk about how people actually are people and have feelings. Okay, I do want you to know classical conditioning and operant conditioning. If you remember from, again, Psych 101 courses, classical conditioning is Pavlov and his salivating dogs. So we have food that's associated with a tuning fork. Every time they hear the noise, food appears. So then they associate the noise with food, which makes them salivate. So then they just have to hear the noise and they start salivating. Operant conditioning is B.F. Skinner and, well, his pigeons, right? And operant conditioning is the idea that we do things for reward or punishment. So, I do the same behavior every day because I get candy for it. That kind of thing, okay? So do know the difference between classical and operant conditioning. Social learning and cognition also goes along with the behavioral perspective. Behavioral perspective is pretty straightforward, right? We also have counter conditioning, which is the process of replacing an undesired response to a stimulus with an acceptable response. Okay. We also have something called systematic desensitization. Now, systematic desensitization is actually used quite often. We will talk about this more when we talk about anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorders. But the idea is, let me give you an example. So maybe maybe you're scared of snakes, right? And so therefore we slowly introduce talking about snakes. And once you can handle that, then we introduce pictures of snakes. And then eventually we put a snake in a cage in another room, but you know it's there. And then eventually we put the snake in the room. Okay, systematically, slowly desensitize you to this thing that caused you fear before. Okay, contingency management. This is like the token economy. This is basically getting rewards for desired behaviors, right? I do well at work, I get paid. And then not providing rewards for undesirable behaviors. I stay home from work, I don't get paid. Okay. And the last is participant modeling. And that is simply that we will do what we see other people doing. I'm going to move on from those things. Please review them if you don't grasp one of those things or if you haven't learned it before. Okay. This is cognitive. What happened? Okay. So I don't know. These seem a little out of order for some reason, but this is more of now our cognitive perspective. Okay, so I'm going to jump here. So with our cognitive perspective, we have cognitive restructuring, cognitive behavioral therapy, and something called acceptance and commitment therapy. Okay, so the idea is that we have thoughts, right? I'm going to go out of order here. One of the main names in cognitive therapy is Beck. So Beck's cognitive therapy initially developed for depression. The idea is that depression is caused by disordered thoughts. Nothing ever goes right for me. Nothing will ever go right for me. I am horrible. These types of big ideas. We have an information processing bias. So attention, interpretation, recall of negative and positive information is biased in depression. So we remember more of the negative things and we don't remember more of the positive things. Okay. The idea is that we help people notice these maladaptive thoughts and we talk about changing them. Okay. So if somebody comes in and says, I always fail, right? Super generic statement there. I always fail. And we say, oh, okay, well, do you always fail? Well, I mean, not always. Sometimes I do things right. Okay, well, what percentage of the time does it seem like you fail or not fail? Oh, well, actually, I mean, like 30% of the time I fail. Okay, so you don't always fail. So what about that other, 70% of the time? What's going on there? And we can sort of retrain thoughts. The idea is that we have this sort of what we call a drill down negative cognitive process happening. Okay, we have a dysfunctional attitude. Maybe people will probably think less of me if I make a mistake. We have the experience. I gave the wrong answer in class. An automatic thought, people think I'm stupid. And then a negative emotion, I feel sad and useless. And down here lives depression. Okay, so we do call attention to this negative drill down process and we say, okay, where can we stop this? You notice this and then you notice yourself going here, or you notice this happening and you notice yourself going here. How can we change that thinking right now so that we get out of this drill down process? We also talk about this as a cognitive triad. So like in a triangle, if you think about thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and we talk about them all affecting each other. That's more of a cognitive behavioral therapy. And we talk about how we need to either change our behaviors, change our thoughts, or change our feelings in order to change all of it. We do it slowly. Okay, so we did that. Moving on. Humanistic, right? So humanistic, we have Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, and they just were so tired of everybody just speaking about people in such a negative and behavioral way that they said, hello, people are people, right? The humanistic perspective believes that people are motivated to strive to be better, to strive for self-fulfillment and meaning in life. Carl Rogers talked about person-centered therapy or client-centered therapy, and that is where we see the client as an unconditionally positive person, and we have something called unconditional positive regard towards that person. So that is, we believe that they are good and that they want to be good. Self-actualization. If you know, again, if you've taken a psych course before, you should know Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We need to have clothing and shelter and safety before we can even start thinking about our feelings and emotions, before we can then get to what they call higher thinking or self-actualization. You have to have those basic needs met. If you do not have your basic needs met, you can't even think about those higher cognitive processes. All right, so treatment for this is just basically speaking to someone with unconditional positive regard, or something we call motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing is simply not arguing against someone, but saying, listening and responding to what they've said in an active listening way and saying, okay, well, is that working for you? If so, keep doing it. If not, maybe you want to change it. But they have to come up with wanting to change on their own. We look at the pros and cons of changing the behavior and the pros and cons of not changing the behavior and really weighing out, well, what's best. I like that better than, I think there are therapists that think that they know what's best for other people. And I don't agree with that. I think that a person knows kind of what's best for them, but I'm going to listen to them and I'm going to hear sort of what their beliefs are, what their values are, and then help them sort of figure out what they think is best for them. All right. Sociocultural perspective. This emphasizes the way that individuals are influenced by people, social institutions, and social forces. Should be pretty self-explanatory, right? So within that, we look at social discrimination. We look at social influences and historical events. Some treatments that we use family therapy, group therapy, milieu therapy, multicultural approaches. Within the family perspective, the idea is that it's assumed that abnormality is caused by disturbances in the pattern of interactions, around the family, and the pattern of relationships within the family. So the idea is that there is no one identified patient. There's no one person that is bad or causing the problem, but that the dynamics people might say psychodynamic or family dynamic perspectives, where we're looking at the interactions and the relationships. Okay, so where does that leave us? Well, one of my favorite words, and that is biopsychosocial. Okay, and this is an integrative approach. Integrative approaches are what most clinicians use, and that is, we may say, you know what, I want to have unconditional positive regard for somebody. We're going to use behavioral techniques when appropriate. We are going to use family techniques when appropriate, and we intellectually integrate different approaches. We're of course going to talk about the brain and biology and how all that plays in. That's a necessity. But this is the big idea, is that with all these perspectives, with all of these paradigms, we really need to integrate more than one to find the best approach. Okay. I've talked a lot. You've hung in here with me. I appreciate it. I will see you next time.